For those of you who don't know my work, I am a painter who also makes prints in quite a haphazard way, my printmaking. But I've been learning since being at Slaughterhaus new techniques, which is great. But I'm primarily a painter. And whilst at Wimbledon, I'd been making, in the previous year, I'd been making paintings from film stills and TV stills, but I was much more interested in the kind of set rather than the action or the figures. And then I came to this painting in third year, which was from a small clipping from a magazine. And it really resonated with a lot of things that I was interested in about interiors, but also that kind of aspirational magazine life and setting your home and being very house proud and what those connotations are of the domestic space. So there's sort of commentary on class, but not maybe sort of overt, but there are lots of things that I was interested that all came together, and reading Bachelard's Oneric view of sort of domestic spaces being the potential for a kind of nostalgic daydream, I suppose, and references to sort of Vermeers that I loved, and working from photographs, which was lots of artists. Okay, is everyone else getting an echo? Is it just me? Yeah. Ooh, maybe it stopped. So a Peter Doig exhibition had a big influence on me in my A-level years that I went to with my mum, who's here. So that kind of freedom of working with photographs, but also my A-level teacher or head of art, Mrs. Benton. I actually think there might be someone who was from my school here, she was quite a mad woman, but she really instilled in us an understanding of the idea of negative space, and this became like the linchpin of the way I made work, actually, from photographs, thinking about kind of abstract space, abstract flattened areas of colour that came together to describe figurative space. And I had a brilliant tutor who's a superb painter as well, Nelson Duplexito, at Wimbledon. He shows at Aleph Contemporary if anyone wants to check out his work, because he's really brilliant. But he also, one of the things that he really instilled in his students, painting students, was an idea about the economy of means and how little you have to do to describe something, to communicate an idea. And I took that at the time to be about a kind of a reduction of information when it came to making figurative work and describing space. So very flattened sort of photographic language is what I took it at the time, but I've actually subsequently been thinking about it very differently in the past year or so. So it'll be interesting at the end of the talk to kind of loop back to Nelson. And also at this time, I'd fallen in love with going to the theatre, and it was like incredibly cheap to go as a student, so I went all the time. And I was really interested in the stage sets and the kind of weight given to objects on stage. And there's again that reduction of information of how little you need in a space to get to like evoke another world that you're stepping into with the actors. And I always loved that moment when like everyone hushed and the stage was lit before the actors came on. And I think that really resonated with me, both for its kind of that, I guess it's also super artificial. So it kind of related back to these like magazine worlds that I would daydream or project myself into. So I graduated, and there's the first sort of major exhibition, or actually no, but my first solo exhibition was at the Foundry Gallery in Chelsea, which is a brilliant gallery run within an architect's practice, and they're really interested in kind of depictions of space, architectural space, I suppose, and they have a really interesting programme. And hopefully I'm going to be doing another show with them next year, sort of returning back and doing another show. But so this was in 2013. It was my first opportunity to make kind of all-encompassing exhibition of my own, I suppose. And I was thinking back to that love of the theatre and the theatricality. And this is a vast painting at the time. And it sort of spanned 4 meters up to 190 centimeters. And it had that feeling of like a proscenium arches. And I began to think a lot more about decorative quality of painting. I was looking at Vuillard's panel paintings at the time, and really like delighting in kind of speckled marks and colour and that kind of thing, and feeling much more abstracted in some senses. There also like symbolism going on, and still kind of thinking about that very British preoccupation with the home and this kind of, yeah, quite a kind of, yeah, British preoccupation with homemaking and garden making, and things like that. And then I continued to sort of make paintings in a similar theme along the lines of kind of these historical or historical interiors they kind of lent towards. And I was really interested in in fabrics and pattern and decoration and how I could play with that. And they lent themselves to things that I really enjoyed painting, basically. And I really enjoyed the way that things were lit, so that it kind of objects will almost dissolve in the light, and then you kind of have these intricate patterns that came up against another pattern, and it just lent itself to a particular kind of painting. And I really enjoyed it for some time, and then it sort of tipped over into feeling like a bit of a constraining thing, and they were very tight. And I also was aware that they dealt with quite a lot of things, themes, but I didn't have the language or the ability to articulate them either in paint or in language. So I was really struggling to sort of push them forward, and I had a kind of more commercial pressure to make paintings to sell. So I was finding it hard to take risks and knowing where to go with it. So it's at this point that I applied to go to the drawing year at the Royal Drawing School and spend a year doing observational drawing. I kind of knew in my gut that I wasn't quite ready for a master's, for that kind of rigorous academic approach for masters, but I wanted to sort of push myself and do something different. So I went to the Royal Drawing School for a year, and it was I don't know if you're familiar with how it works, but it's a scholarship program, and you sort of pick your syllabus out of the public program of drawing classes, and it's brilliant because you're immersed in, or you're given a whole load of different approaches to drawing. And of course that's kind of the linchpin of figurative painting, or visual art perhaps. But actually at Wimbledon there was very little focus on drawing or any teaching in drawing, so it's something that I hadn't really spent time doing since being at school. So it was really brilliant, and each term you'd have up to sort of 9 tutors, all different working artists, had very different approaches to visual language. So I learned a ton, but there was very little time to actually make my own work in that time of learning and sort of making a living and you know, London life. So I left, and it was also quite a tumultuous year for my like personal life. So I left feeling really uncertain, or I came to the end of the year and felt like quite uncertain, and made these very small works that made slight changes. So I've just got distracted because Michael's computer's on and it looks like I'm on a Zoom call. But I'm hoping I'm not. It's got crits going on with the students. I hope I'm not in it. I might just turn his computer the other way. The drama of Zoom. So as I say, anyway, I'd made some small changes. At that point, I knew I really needed to go and like process what I'd learned. I'd learned loads, but kind of no time to think about it. So I applied both for a master's that I was unsure whether I was ready to do, and for a residency. And fortunately, I got the residency and didn't get the master's. So I went up to Derbyshire for a year with the Jonathan Vickers Fine Art Award, which is a really generous award, which gives you both a kind of stipend and a studio. I did some teaching at the university, and then it ended in a solo exhibition in the museum with a catalogue, which was just the sort of best experience for my sort of mid-20s, to have that kind of time to make a body of work. And there was some like mixed success within the work itself, but the experience of making an exhibition and building it, so we actually built this wall to sort of present it, and thinking about expectation, it sort of fed back into that interest in like the theatre of exhibiting and things like that. And I was also drawn to this award because it had a theme, and I thought that might sort of solve some of those content crisis questions that I was going through, of kind of like, why am I making these things and I don't have the language to talk about it, and I feel quite self-conscious about the themes that I'm sort of working it with, sort of heritage and sort of empire and all of these like heavy things I didn't quite know how to go into, but knew that there was like rich pickings. So I thought if I went and did a themed residency, that because I had a more specific narrative, it might help me get over some of those kind of self-conscious things. So kind of in the kind of Dexter Dorward vein, of having particular spaces or narratives behind each painting. And these were all referencing, the theme of it was the changing faces of Derbyshire, and these are all referencing the lives of important women, and which was actually really nifty as it turned out, because I got to meet like the living ones, obviously. And so I met an amazing poet, Sandeep Palmer, and an amazing activist, Jasvinder Sangera, and also a boxer. So there were some really like incredible moments of meeting these people and making this work and putting on this show. But I actually still felt quite self-conscious about the work itself at the time, and knew I had to go back and sort out a master's. I hadn't had time during the residency to sort of put together an application. So I went back to London. Oh, just to show you some of the other works in the show. This was interesting because it was the first time I was like layering different references, I suppose. It's like a William Morris and a floor and different things. It was sort of less truly photographic. This was the first time I was kind of playing with using wallpaper to lift paint off. So almost like a monotype within the painting, within the paint. And I was obviously still using this sort of negative space and pattern making within the image, and playing around with it dissolving and reappearing and that kind of thing. And this is the first monotype that I actually have ever exhibited. And it was, I'd actually been making monotypes for quite a few years. A good friend of mine, Rosie Prince, who also has a studio at the Slaughterhaus where I am currently and have been, showed me how to make monotypes without a press. And they really appealed to me because they were somewhere between drawing and painting. And obviously some of those, the wiping away technique really lent itself to that kind of negative space type of drawing. And then this more trace monotype offered lots of potential for making ghosts and making that kind of incidental tone and mark for monotype, and introducing a bit of chance and magic into the making. So I sort of continued to make monotypes, but that was the first I'd exhibited. And then I returned to London knowing that I wanted to make portfolios for masters, and being quite cautious about kind of not wanting to slip back into making paintings to sell quickly and not having time to reflect on them or to make big changes. But I was really motivated to sort of challenge myself within what I was doing to make this application. And this is one of the pieces that I felt was more successful at the time, and I was interested in kind of challenging the viewers' perception of space, and they're complicating their relationship to the spaces depicted. I remember reading a really interesting essay by Foucault on heterotopias and the idea of a mirror being a virtual space, but you project yourself into it. So it's sort of like real and unreal at the same time. And I kind of using all the similar motifs of this like negative space where things are dissolving and appearing, and mirrors and objects depicted by light and flattened patterns and pictures within pictures. So it's like kind of recurring motifs, but I was trying to sort of push further. So I applied for sitting guilds and really wanted to go there. So I turned up and I felt terrified to start painting because it felt like so many traps of things that I had been doing for a while and wasn't happy with. So I began making monotypes more seriously. And so again, it was like that bridge between drawing and painting. And I was tiling them up and making them bigger and bigger to make them feel more like a kind of enveloping space, so more of an experience of looking and exploring something, overlapping spaces and marks and different things. And there was something about the texture of the monotype that really resonated with some of the imagery I was making, and I really felt like I had to go there and interrogate those images and really like take it on, face on, and try and find language to describe the things that I was making and the imagery and how the imagery related, because the content crisis had to come to a head. So I really like went for it and went for like big stately homes. I was going for like massive really wealthy interiors full of texture and objects and antiques and things. I began to write my thesis about, so really tuning into that feeling, that initial feeling from that first painting and this slideshow of both enjoying the experience of sort of daydreaming myself into a space, and also feeling quite uncertain about my relationship to it, be it the sort of like class connotations of performative relationship to a house at a home, and being sort of house proud, and a house being quite a complicated space of both a sanctuary but also, you know, complicated relationships, and feeling vulnerable or being yourself or hiding away, and all of these, you know, like very layered experiences of domesticity and class and, you know, representation and all of these things. So now I'm blathering on. Where have I got to? I'll go to the next one. So this is, they got bigger and they were tiling up. I was interested in nostalgia. They were coming from photographs, so this kind of speckled texture of the monotype almost felt like it was appearing or disappearing, like that entropic, I think is the word, of something almost like a photographic process, analog photographic process or film or something like that. And I was just sort of leaning into it and embracing it and having these really difficult conversations that made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. And this was sort of, and like putting me on the spot about kind of white privilege and what that meant, sort of pre Black Lives Matter, really throwing myself into quite dense texts. I had a really incredible tutor, John Shaw, who helped me find my way through this like incredibly nerve-wracking content, I suppose. And here we go. This one on the left is a hanging one, so it sort of moved and it was lit from behind, and the one on the right was designed to go around, so it's kind of a ghost print with another print on top, so I was layering things still, and it's sort of designed to go around a corner. So they became much more like immersive theatrical installations and experiences of looking, and this was my sort of interim, where you're sort of beginning. It's only a year, 12-month course, so it's incredibly like jam-packed and you have to make decisions really quickly. So I had to sort of decide for my interim what my degree show was going to be sort of edging towards, and I was interested in layering experiences again, thinking back to those paintings that I sort of applied with, of complicating the spatial relationship between the viewer and the object, the viewer and the like space depicted as well. So I sort of started to layer actual objects and collage spaces and make installations. This is a large monotype on Japanese paper, oil on canvas, and then there are some little etchings of some Dutch still lives that sort of manipulated as well. And finally, this is my degree show piece. Again, large scale monotypes. Either side, I decided to make it a completely kind of enveloping space that you came around the corner and become sort of immersed in this green wash of colour. And either side were some shipwrecks that were slightly different crop sections that faced one another, that were I was trying to really make it quite vertiginous. So your relationship to it was made a little bit uncertain or unsettling, I suppose, in some ways. And then an incredibly still image in the middle that felt like no one was breathing in there, and so that like contrast. And then over the top, I'd made these little paintings like this one that acted much more like objects or antiques or collectibles. And I think all the way through, I've been quite interested in the value we give things, or and it's very much, these paintings very much play into that kind of idea of the like valuable art object, like art with a capital A next to your antiques. So there's like quite I have quite a ongoing themes that come and go. But and I'm kind of torn between loving and find it quite uncomfortable. Some of the things that I'm interested in. So I left City & Guilds and was still feeling quite uncomfortable about making paintings. So this was a hybrid of monotypes pasted onto canvas and then washes of colour over the top. And these coincided with having made a series of paintings and prints and drawings from female Dutch still life artists, Clara Peters and Rachel Roish. So I think that's a Rachel Roish. And I'd always been fascinated by Dutch still lives for their kind of mastery and that sort of the arrogance that it takes to, or it's like the pinnacle of painting, that feeling of like mastering death and making these like exquisite, perfectly depicted spaces. And yeah, so these were part of a kind of series of, the one on the left was a part of the series of that, and the one on the right was thinking back to those like tapestries. And I actually intended to make a much larger version of this painting, which I still have in my mind's eye, to make an enormous tapestry. And then 2020, the world collapsed, and in a way, one of the positives was that everything sort of slowed down, and I was all the restrictions happened, and which meant that I wasn't able to carry on making large pieces of work. All of the exhibitions were cancelled, so it wasn't like I had any upcoming, I didn't need to make massive oil paintings for anything. So I started making these small watercolors, and I also felt like I wasn't really able to commit to anything larger, and these were all I was really capable of, partly because of the pandemic, but partly because of a recent loss and bereavement, which meant I just found it really difficult to be in the studio and feel kind of content painting. So these became a lovely little escape, and I gave myself permission just to make what I wanted, of what I wanted, and not feel self-conscious and not have that kind of ongoing content crisis or feeling. I think I got that impression that I'm really reevaluating at the moment, that you really have to justify what you're making. And I think this was the beginning of me sort of allowing myself to inhabit the painting and allowing the painting to be in and of itself the thing, and not attach too much language to them necessarily. So the importance of the colour and mark and the materiality of watercolour became much more important, and I just began to really enjoy making them. So I think like the upside of having I guess like an upheaval in the world was that I just thought that, this isn't make or break. I can make, I suppose, in the world and in my world, it's kind of not make or break. I can just enjoy making these things for now, quietly and on a small scale. And this was one of the last ones. I was sort of starting to scale it up and thinking about moments of description and moments of just colour and wash, and the surface becoming, I guess that's long been an interest of mine, but like going in and out of focus, and allowing the paint a little bit more agency, I suppose, in that than I had it before, where they were sort of much more uptight, I suppose. So I think it sort of goes back to that expression from Nelson about the economy of means, and what's needed and what's actually what's needed. And for me at this point, it became much more that I wanted the paint to do things. I wanted the paint to speak and have a bit more agency in it. So then I scaled this up. This is much larger, and I was thinking about, if I made it larger, then you'd have larger pockets of just abstract colour meeting each other and overlapping and things like that. And I was using really, really naff search terms like morning light aesthetic, and sort of following rabbit holes into these really kind of kitsch images that were just sort of soothing to me somehow, and almost acted like daydreams. And finally, this one, I was sort of beginning to work in series, and I was thinking about different levels of escapism, because everything was shut down and we were like in our home. So even going to the studio felt like such an amazing feeling of escape. And then once I was there, I was sort of spending time projecting myself into these other spaces. And then there was the space of the painting and how colour and form interacted and how I reacted to those. There was sort of like this dysphoria, like this feeling of just being in multiple spaces at the same time and really losing myself in the process of making. And on a selfish level, that was really what I was getting out of these. But I thought that I sort of had that epiphany moment of like, oh, if I inhabit that long enough, it will be the experience of looking at these will mimic that, because that's how art works. It's like a sort of mirror. And that leads me to this most recent series of watercolor monotypes, which felt like a really magical confluence of my experience of making monotypes and painting and the watercolors all came together in this series. And I really, again, wanted to just allow myself to enjoy the process. And because monoprinting has that kind of moment of making and at the moment of the reveal, that felt like a nice thing. And there's also that feeling of peeling something back and almost like glimpsing your subconscious or something, that you've like made this thing and then you're surprised at what it looks like when it's revealed, and it kind of it reveals itself to you, which is, yeah, it's really beautiful. And the quality of watercolor monotype is really special because it's almost like hovering on the top of the surface because of the way it's made. You put it through a press with damp paper and it lifts off the pigment, like it sort of reignites dry pigment and lifts it onto the paper, and it just feels like it's floating there. And there's a special luminosity to the kind of paper, the white of the paper coming through. So they're really lovely to make. And I began by going to my sort of natural, I guess, like 10-year-old self and trying to make pictures of things and trying to like describe things really well and get like a representational kick. And then increasingly they became much more about an experience, or kind of the experience of beholding things or seeing things or remembering things or something like that, I think. Or the experience of just putting pigment down, it could just be that, but there's this kind of much more abstracted, I suppose. And again, I'm going back to that kind of interest in decoration, the decorative, and whether the decorative being a form of expression and that being actually enough. So that joy of just things that are decorative or beautiful being a form of expression in itself. And they became sort of moving more towards abstraction, I suppose. And I've been thinking a little bit more about these as again, it's an escape, but also thinking more about kind of desire, I suppose, in them, and my experience of making them, I suppose. And there also, because I knew that I wanted to make a series of these for this exhibition that I'm having with Michelle, who's here, from Wilder Gallery. It just went live today, and it's fundraising for the brain tumor charity, and these all feel quite, all my recent work feels quite entwined, sadly, with that. And so they feel really precious to me on many levels. And whenever I come to titling work, I tend to just go back over texts that spring to mind that I've read or that I was reading recently that I was making notes from, and underline a whole ton of things, and then sort of allocate titles to things. I'm not a natural wordsmith, so I borrow beautifully written words by much cleverer people. And this series of work is called Between 6 and 7. And it's taken from a passage from Mrs. Dalloway. And I think also these were all made sort of end of winter, beginning of spring. And it's that moment where you get a bit longer and you have that kind of magical hour or so extra of like half light, and the spring flowers and that kind of thing glow in that slightly elongated day. So these were all made like in the last few months, and it seems to just really resonate. And also from this passage, and also the kind of the grey white moths, it felt really reminiscent of the surface of a monotype, of a watercolor monotype, how it just hovers almost like the dust on like a moth's wing, which sounds really twee, but it just really stuck with me. So that's what this series of monotypes is titled. And then I wanted to bring some of that sort of joy of surface and decoration and abstraction back into the studio, painting studio, and I began to make these much more abstracted sketches and studies of things from similar source material. And these are just iPhone photos of recent works in progress in the studio. So just a selection of them. So you can see where it's sort of feeding back into my oil painting practice, where things are beginning to sort of dissolve and fragment and become more abstracted. And I guess for me, these feel totally terrifying because they feel much more revealing, and I feel really vulnerable around and towards them. But I'm hoping that that kind of renewed openness is interesting to look at, because they feel sort of, yeah, kind of much more vulnerable in a way. And I think I have been thinking a lot about that kind of economy of means. And I think that that reduction method of making that I'd employed earlier from the photographs was very much like a defensive mechanism of not using gesture, of not, of kind of avoiding a lot of things. And I think I'm now trying to sort of face them, that kind of gesture, and being a bit scared of my own work and being surprised at what they look like. And I think that's really been brought about by this sort of last year watercolor monotypes, and renewed interest in like different effects of oil painting. This very much for me feels like it's to do with the kind of decoration, to do with sort of chintz, and but also lots of other things that feels daunting. So that is the end of the talk. I realise I probably spoke really quickly. If you want to check out the exhibition, I put the link here that's really hard to read, but it's Wilder Gallery. And also I didn't put the full website. And it's fundraising for the brain tumour charity.